We are. Sorry about that. And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for August 13th. We are really excited about the webinar tonight. But before we get there, I want to thank everyone that is a lab member for supporting Los Angeles Birders. Your support helps us put on webinars like this. We excuse me, your support helps us to archive these webinars, and we have a wonderful library of webinars on our website at labirders.org. We also offer community science projects. We have lots of field trips. We have lots of things to take advantage of. And members of Los Angeles Birders usually get, in fact, always get first dibs to whatever we are presenting, be it webinars or field trips or other things. So please, it's not expensive. We really do appreciate your support. And next, please. And with that, I would like to introduce Calvin Bond, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Calvin?
Thanks, Ron. I'm very pleased to introduce Diego Blanco as our speaker tonight. Diego is a birder and naturalist from Los Angeles, California. He enjoys hiking, camping, and documenting biodiversity through photography and illustration. His early years sketching backyard birds and learning to identify songs. Are you good?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay. Songs and calls of birds all throughout Los Angeles were formative experiences that, coupled with a fascination for the mysteries of the paleontology and the prehistoric past, continue to inform his curiosity and passion for ecology and evolutionary biology. Diego graduated Cornell University in 2022, majoring in environment and sustainability, and has worked as an administrative assistant at the Theodore Payne Foundation for Wildflowers and Native Plants, where he taught field sketching and bird identification classes. He spent a season as a point count technician with the Calumet Bird Observatory, conducting surveys on bird populations and plant communities. Diego is currently a research technician at the Moore Lab of Zoology, where he is working on the 3D modeling project, in addition to specimen preparation, conducting lab tours, and campus birdwalks. Without further ado, please welcome Diego Blanco.
Thank you so much, Calvin. I'm so happy to be here with all of you tonight to talk about one of my long-standing favorite topics when it comes to ecology, evolutionary biology, which is the story of how we got the birds that we have today. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation here, so bear with me when I share the screen.
There.
Okay,
oh,
there we go.
Yeah,
align it right here.
There you go. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, is that in view?
Perfect.
Perfect. So to kick this off, I have a couple of my own illustrations actually of in the back here we have Daspletosaurus torosus, and we have in the front Rapaxavis cani. These are two species, both from the Mesozoic, that although they look pretty different, are pretty closely related in terms of the wider spectrum of reptiles and vertebrate diversity. So what I want to get across to you all tonight is the story of how we went from having, gargantuan, monstrous, toothy dinosaurs like Spletosaurus in the back to something that looks sort of like a modern bird today. And to start us off, I wonder, has anyone seen this mural at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology? It's painted by an artist named Jane Kim, and it basically shows, these are just sections of the mural here, but it shows the whole diversity of birds throughout the globe. They're painted life-size, it's 25,000 square feet, and it just shows in fantastic detail the range of morphology and plumage variation and lifestyle that you see represented by birds across the world. But if you look at the very back left of the mural, and you have to go see this in person to see it, so I recommend you all pay a visit to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. But if you were to walk into that room and step over to the stairway on the left side of this mural, next to all of the beautifully rendered full color paintings of birds, life size by Denardiat, uh, we have this here. And here's the artist penciling in this Eutyrannus. So why is a dinosaur that arguably bears almost no resemblance to our modern birds, what is it doing on this same mural as, great Indian hornbill and the cassowary and the quetzal that we see here too? Well, you might, and I'm sure everybody listening to this webinar has some idea that birds are very close. Birds are related to all the other dinosaurs that we know of. In fact, they are just a subset of theropod dinosaurs that didn't go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period. You might have heard that birds evolved from dinosaurs, and sometimes the picture that gets painted with that is that, the asteroid hit and a couple dinosaurs that didn't really look like birds made it through, and over time they transitioned into the birds that we see. But what we actually find to be the case is that birds had assumed their modern form, although there weren't any species that we would recognize as ones that we had encountered. They weren't flying around at the end of the Cretaceous period, but anatomically, modern birds were around at the end of the Cretaceous period, and there's a whole litany of relatives, steps, branches on that phylogenetic tree leading up to modern birds that sort of place them in an evolutionary context, which is what we're going to be exploring tonight. So my aim for this is just to kind of basically walk you through the phylogeny and give you a guided tour of the diversity of stem birds, which in phylogenetics, to refer to a group of organisms as the stem organisms refers to the fact that they are branches along the tree that are no longer with us. So the crown group would be the modern birds, and those are the ones that are extant today. But the stem birds are the steps that, didn't leave any modern descendants behind. And those are the ones that we're going to be walking through during this presentation. Now, if we really want to start with the beginning, we have to go way, 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 way back. Perhaps not this far back to the time of Tiktaalik rosier, one of the earliest tetrapods, amphibious fish that crawled out of the ocean and inhabited these lakeside environments. Now, I wonder if those limnologists would be studying these if they were around at the time. But maybe a little bit more recent. And the first place that I want to start is in northeastern China about 125 million years ago. Now, what is now Liaoning province during the early Cretaceous period was a hotbed for prehistoric ecosystems. It was a whole diverse array of forest and lake environments that, because of the environmental conditions consisting of volcanic activity and lake environments, it was really, really, it lent itself well to the preservation of really fine detail in the fossils that were formed by the animals that died there. So we have a really, really complete picture of the ecosystem that was around at the time. And just right off the bat here, we have a fish, we have a lacewing fossil, and we have a plant cone. This plant cone isn't related to anything that's around today. The fish is, and so is the lacewing. But it's not just dinosaurs, although there were dinosaurs around at this time. Because of the preservation and the conditions for preservation that this environment provided, we're able to see just the comprehensive range, even all the way down to pollen samples from the plants that were around that allow us to reconstruct the ecosystem at the time. So based on that information, then this is a beautiful reconstruction of what paleontologists think the environment would have looked like at the time by an artist named John Conway. You'll see that name come up quite a few times throughout this presentation, since seeing as these animals have been dead for 125 million years, it was a little hard for me to find modern photographers that had high quality photos of these things. So you'll see that I rely pretty heavily on paleo art, which is a discipline that I greatly enjoy and I feel is one of the best ways that you can train yourself to think about evolutionary biology, because reconstructing extinct species, you don't have the luxury of just depicting something that's already there. You kind of have to work backwards from the bones and piece together what the animal might have looked like. And then once you get to that point, you can sort of piece together what the ecosystem is like. So here we have a hadrosaur, one of the large herbivorous dinosaurs that was common at this time in the Cretaceous period. And remember, the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs, is divided into three periods. First was the Triassic period. The second in the middle was the Jurassic, and the latest was the Cretaceous. So this is the beginning of the Cretaceous period. And the animals that we see flying around there are not birds, but they're pterosaurs. So pterosaurs, along with dinosaurs and crocodiles, are part of a group of reptiles called archosaurs. And that grouping is based on certain features of their skull anatomy, the number of holes that they have in their skull for their eye socket and in the front of their skull to provide support. So among living animals, the closest living relatives of birds are crocodiles, which I'm willing to bet that a lot of you already. But what we see here in this picture are a couple of aneurognathid pterosaurs. Now, they didn't have feathers, but they had kind of, it's debated whether or not these structures called pycnofibers that look kind of like fuzz on their bodies are homologous with feathers or not, but they were, you know, a vital component of that ecosystem back then. So that next brings us to this little fossil, and this is a dinosaur called Sinosauropteryx prima, and it was one of the first dinosaurs that was found that preserved evidence of feathers at all. So before the actual discovery of hard evidence that showed that dinosaurs had at least filamentous feathers, because in the early evolution of feathers, they weren't anything like what we see in modern birds today. The feathers of modern birds are highly specialized for flight and for thermoregulation. You know, any of you have seen the asymmetric flight feathers of the birds that we have today. They're narrower on one end. They have a complex structure with the rachis in the center and the vein coming out of it. None of this was present in Sinosauropteryx. So what you can see, Mark or Ron, can you see my cursor here on the screen? If I point to things?
Yes,
okay, great.
We can see your cursor.
So excellent. So you'll notice that here are the filaments going all along the back of the dinosaur, and you can even see that they're sort of broken up a little bit along the tail into what almost looks like a banding pattern. Typically, when you find fossil remains of extinct animals, there's almost no chance that the pigmentation or the color that the animal would have been in life survives hundreds of millions of years of compression under sedimentary rock. But in some cases, which we'll get into with some more vivid examples later, the cells that produce the pigment in both modern birds and extinct dinosaurs do stand the test of time. They do remain preserved in the same configuration and in the same more or less color spectrum and the patterns that correspond to the colors that they produce in modern birds. They do remain in the fossils in some cases. So that allowed paleontologists to reconstruct the life appearance of this Sinosauropteryx dinosaur, which would have found itself in an unfortunate situation at the bottom of the lake 125 million years ago, but fortunate for us because now we have this whole window into what the earliest feathered dinosaurs might have looked like. And the development of feathers is sort of, it's an example of exaptation, which is a process where an adaptation or a trait is developed in a certain group of organisms for one reason, but then through selective pressures that are found in the environment, it becomes useful for a whole number of other different reasons. So the earliest dinosaurs had simple filamentous feathers. They didn't have complex branching structure. They didn't have the barbs and hooks that allow birds to zip their feathers up into a clean aerofoil surface or that kind of sleek insulation that they have over their bodies. But they would have provided some degree of thermoregulatory benefit. And as you can see by this banding pattern on the tail here, they probably were used for display throughout the spectrum of organisms that we find with these simple feathers. So there's Sinosauropteryx, right? Now, Sinosauropteryx was far from the only feathered animal running around in northeastern China at this time in Earth's history. This is a great illustration. I love it because it sort of imagines what these species might have looked like if they were prepared in a museum collection. And having spent the last couple of weeks preparing specimens at Occidental's Moore Lab of Zoology, I found this to be a helpful tool and a cool way to visualize it, because it shows the breadth of animals that are represented by the fossils in the area where Sinosauropteryx came from. So that province in China, Liaoning province, is home to a couple different fossil-bearing formations, all more or less sequentially linked with one another. We'll go through and talk about where the stars of our show going forward are each from, but by and large, the Yixian Formation, which is labeled here up at the top, is one of the richest and most diverse ecosystems that we have represented by the fossils from northeastern China. And you can see there's a whole cluster of pterosaurs up here. You have one mammal, a couple feathered dinosaurs. Here's our Sinosauropteryx to scale with all the other animals that would have been found around there. You have some early relatives of Triceratops. So these are Psittacosaurus and Liaoceratops, which are among the earliest or basal-most ceratopsians you see in the fossil record. We've got this great big paddlefish, Podopsiphyrus, which is a crazy looking skull that they've got preserved in the bottom right here. But on the left here, this is really the focus of what we're going to get into. This is a whole suite of feathered dinosaurs that are not themselves birds. But if you were to see any of these animals, walking around in the forest today, for all intents and purposes, we might call them birds anyway. I mean, they had feathered wings, they had many of the same display structures, they had the same anatomical makeup, the same kinds of structure of their legs, and same perhaps behaviors in a lot of cases that modern birds have today. But there are a few really key anatomical differences that we'll get into. So among that whole represented fauna of northeastern China, the line that includes the bird lineage are the theropod dinosaurs. And these are probably the most famous of the extinct non-avian dinosaurs. I mean, this guy right here is Tyrannosaurus rex, needs no introduction. But this is the ancestral body plan that was inherited and modified by birds in such a specialized way to end up with something like a bee hummingbird. So although Tyrannosaurus was not the direct ancestor of modern birds, the ancestors of modern birds did share anatomical similarities with dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus. And to that end, I'm a big fan of phylogenetic trees as a tool to visualize evolutionary relationships. I mean, they're by far and away the most efficient way to do it. And they avoid one of the pitfalls of talking about evolution, which I think can be this idea that there's a sequential step change towards a certain end, whether it's birds or humans or whatever it may be, whatever group of organisms you're looking at. The story of evolution is has a lot more dead ends, so to speak. It has a lot more experiments and a lot more branches that are themselves highly specialized and derived radiations of living organisms, which I might add were well suited to their environment. I mean, we tend to think of dinosaurs as the precursors that our early mammalian ancestors had to tolerate for enough time to finally decide to take themselves out of the dark and under the shadow of these things. But asteroid aside, they were highly specialized and well adapted to their environments. And the lineage and the legacy of modern birds just speaks to that even. So on the left here, we have a subset of theropod dinosaurs. Now, this is our first kind of look into the phylogeny itself. I pruned away some of the earlier branches on this tree because if we were to start chasing each one of those branches down, we'd be here for a lot longer than an hour and a half or so. But Tedinurae is the first category, the first lineage that I want to look at. The translation from the Latin is stiff tails, and it refers to the fact that these animals have really extensive preservation of ligaments along the bones of their tail that would have allowed them to use them as counterbalances when running. This dinosaur here, Sinotyrannus, is also from that same Yixian formation in northeastern China, from Liaoning province. And there are two main groups within Tedinurae that we're going to look at in the course of this presentation. Now, I want to mention the first one, Carnosauria, now, because this is the one that does not lead to modern birds. You can see over here the others, Coelurosauria is condensed in this visualization of the phylogeny, so it just leads straight to a pigeon. But there's a lot more on the way towards the pigeon than is shown in this image. But for now, what's expanded and what we're looking at is this group here, Carnosauria. We've got famous dinosaurs like Spinosaurus, Allosaurus down here, and Carcharodontosaurus, which were huge macro predators. I mean, they were going after 80-ton sauropods, and Spinosaurus is kind of an oddball because it was, first of all, its ecology, before we even get to its ecology, its anatomy has been long disputed because for a long time, the only known fossils were destroyed in bombing of Berlin. And so scientists speculated for a long time what Spinosaurus was doing. But the consensus, which is always changing, but for now, it's basically that this dinosaur was a kind of like a heron and a crocodile mixed into one. It was this gigantic coastal, I mean, it's like a great blue heron with sharp paws and teeth. That's the best way to think about it. But for the most part, they were land-dwelling and active predators that would have been going after large prey. And so that's the earliest outgroup, the first step off the chain to birds. So even within dinosaurs that are not in the bird lineage, you still see the preservation of certain, I hesitate to say the word primitive, but kinds of fibers that are a little bit filaments, that are a little bit like feathers, but they're not quite feathers yet. Although the thinking is that they are homologous, so that feathers are derived from these kinds of things too. This dinosaur that we see on the right here is called Concavinator, and it preserves these strange filaments on its arm, which scientists speculate were used for display. So that's how it's illustrated here. But again, to the point that feathers didn't initially evolve for flight. They were co-opted after a long evolutionary history by the dinosaurs that gave rise to modern birds for flight. And so they're kind of a thing that goes back even before the lineage that most closely leads to birds. So here's a good representative of that sort of convergent evolution. We have two dinosaurs here. On the right, we have Eutyrannus wally, and on the left, we have Allosaurus fragilis. From two completely different times in two completely different places. But I picked these two because they show such a marked morphological similarity in the shape of their skull. They've even got these large crests above the eyes, and you know the body plan overall is so similar in the way that a falcon or a hawk might be similar, even though they're not closely related. So on the right, though, Eutyrannus is, as far as we know, the largest dinosaur that preserved concrete evidence of proto-feathers, the precursors of feathers. Again, from northeastern China and Liaoning province. So the Coelurosaurs are the group that include both Tyrannosaurus. This is Tarbosaurus. This is a nice painting that was done, referenced from a still from the documentary Prehistoric Planet. It's a great documentary. I recommend you should watch it. And on the right here, we've got a Velociraptorine. It's not Velociraptor itself, but it's a little bit closer on the line to modern birds than the Tyrannosaurus sleeping in the back here. So Coelurosauria is the group that is one step more restrictive when it comes to including the ancestors of modern birds. So now one step down the family tree, we have this group. The name means hollow-tailed lizards, and the representative I chose up here was Calescus aristotocus, which is from China as well, and it's one of these early tyrannosaurs that preserved still were at the level of these filamentous feathers that aren't, this dinosaur is clearly far too large to get into the air. We don't yet see any of the specializations for flight or for the kinds of anatomical requirements the lifestyle of birds dictate. But underneath the surface here, we are already seeing some similarities. The hollowed bones of these dinosaurs are the same as those in birds. They have an extensive set of air sacs that go through the back of their vertebrae, and it's thought that it would have functioned the same way as the unidirectional air system in birds does, so that when they're inhaling and exhaling, they're getting a constant stream of oxygen through their bloodstream. And that has what has allowed birds to, accomplish such physiological feats as flying over the Himalayas and migration at low concentrations of oxygen, and what allows them to power the musculature that they need for flight. So it's thought that they got that from their, non-bird ancestor. So within Coelurosauria, you can see we have all these branches going down. Tyrannosauroidea is one of them. That's the one that includes Calescus over here and Tyrannosaurus. And then Compsognathidae, now this is the one that includes Sinosauropteryx from before. So there's a whole grade of dinosaurs that belong to this family that are related to Sinosauropteryx. Some of the more recent thinking, well, I should say some of the more recent speculation states that some of these species in Compsognathidae might actually represent the juvenile versions of other dinosaurs, perhaps in that other group, the Carnosauria, but that's still certainly up for debate. So the one that I want to focus on next is Maniraptoriforms. And then within that, we have two groups, Ornithomimosauria and Maniraptora. And as you can see by this friendly little rock pigeon here, Maniraptor is the one that leads to birds. So we've got a zoomed in version of it over here, and we've got all these really fascinating and highly specialized groups of dinosaurs, which we are not going to talk about today. The Alvarezsaurids, the Therizinosaurids, the Oviraptorosaurids. These are not closely related to modern birds as far as dinosaurs go, but they do bear feathers, and they do display a lot of the same behaviors that that modern birds show. Now, you might ask, how can we possibly know what the behavior of an extinct dinosaur is? But dinosaurs in this group here, the Oviraptorosauria, we have some really fantastic fossils from Mongolia that show them spreading their wings over their nests. It's thought that these individuals that were fossilized were caught in a sandstorm and were quickly buried so that scavengers and microbes didn't get to their bodies. And it shows that they were sitting on top of the eggs that they had laid and protecting them with their wings. So the nesting behavior, right down to the form of the nest, I mean, it looks like almost like a cross between the ground nesting birds like ostriches and emus and nests of crocodiles, because the eggs themselves are elongated and a little different looking than modern bird eggs. But the next group we're going to focus on here is this one called Par-avs, and that means near birds. So here are some good examples. On this cladogram, you can see that there's basically three groups here. There's Dromaeosauridae, there's Troodontidae, and then there's Avialae. And Avialae is the group that leads to modern birds, or the group that contains modern birds and their closest ancestors. And then within that, you have these two other families that are their closest relatives in turn. So the Dromaeosaurids are things like this Velociraptor on the right. This is my favorite illustration of a Velociraptor that I've seen yet. By that artist again, John Conway. And then on the left here, we have Genephanopteryx. A lot of the dinosaurs that are in this group have Chinese binomial names because they were found in that region of northeastern China. So Genepengopteryx was a troodontid. Now you can see at this point, you're starting to get more of the features that you see or associate with modern birds, but you absolutely still do see a lot of the ancestral characters that are inherited from those terrestrial non-bird dinosaurs. So at this point, the tail is still supported by a whole length of bony vertebrae, and the fingers on the hand are still individual. They still bear claws. They're still separately mobile. And as we'll see on the next slide, with this Utah raptor, they still bear these long, elongated claws on the second toe. There's been a lot of research into what these animals might have been using that second claw for. Actually, in another pretty striking case of convergent evolution, if you look at modern raptors like eagles and hawks, they also show an elongation of that innermost toe that's used in the case of eagles to restrain prey while they're bracing themselves above it and sort of balancing themselves with their wings. Previously, it was these animals were pictured as hunting in packs, maybe a little bit like Harris's hawks, and essentially behaving more like wolves in that it was thought that they would, jump on large prey and bring them down with these killing claws. But the more modern schools of thought regarding these animals hold that they were probably predators of smaller dinosaurs, especially even small mammals were around with these animals, and basically they were eating things that they could pin down with their elongated claw and sort of just tear away at with their head while they brace themselves out with their wings. Now, if we peel back the skin on this Utah raptor, we can see that there's differences and there are similarities with modern birds. So the bones of the arm right here, you can see the radius and the ulna. It's not shown in this diagram right here, but in dinosaurs like Velociraptor, if anyone has ever prepared to study skin, you might have had the experience of separating the flight feathers, the secondaries, off from the ulna. And if you look at what's left over on the bone itself, and again, the ulna is this outer bone right here where the flight feathers in modern birds attach. If you look at the bone after those feathers are separated, there are distinct bumps on the bone where each of those keratinous feathers anchor onto the bone, provide support. And those same identical bumps are found on the ulna of extinct dinosaurs as well. So by that we can infer that they would have had elongated feathers on the arm, although they certainly weren't using them for flight at this point. So clearly they've got a robust and tooth-filled skull. They've got a three-fingered hand, like technically modern birds still do. The biggest difference is this long bony tail, and then obviously the elongated claws on the feet, which we talked about. But the biggest differences to pay attention that separate, at least anatomically, these dinosaurs from the closest relatives of birds, or the ones more closely related to birds than they are the tooth-filled skull and the long bony tail. So here is a pretty famous example of a dromaeosaurid, also again from northeastern China, that preserves these really, again, elongated wing feathers on the arms. Now, as you can see by the scale here, this dinosaur was not capable of powered flight. It wasn't even really capable of gliding. And yet, you see the same arrangement of primaries, secondaries, coverts. Even what in birds is reduced to the alula is visible here in this great representation of the animal. But it's attached to the fingers, which are still themselves mobile. So I find it particularly fascinating to see how what we have in modern birds had its origin in structures that aren't present there anymore. They are modified and I say simplified only in the sense that they're condensed. Fused is maybe a better word, at least in the case of the wing. But this was their original context. So, Jen Yuanlong did it first. these dinosaurs were bearing the same kinds of feathers that are closer to those that we see in modern birds. And again, you can see the fact that there's even a differentiation between the contour feathers and the flight feathers, or what would become flight feathers in modern birds on the arm here. We'll see this illustrated in some of the later dinosaurs that we visit, but note that like in many raptors, owls, and even other birds like ptarmigans, you see that the legs are covered in feathers as well. And if you've ever seen the feet of birds, they have two kinds of scales, one on the front of the leg and one on the rest of the leg and on the bottom of the toes. The ones on the front are called scutes. Those are the ones that kind of look like a ladder stacked up on the front. And then the small circular ones, which you can actually see in this painting here, those are called reticulae. And both of those structures are modified feathers. So they're not true scales in the sense that lizards or snakes might have, but they are basically just the keratinous stump of the feather without any of the development of the extensive, or the part that extends out beyond that. So even in modern birds, you can see you can tweak it with sophisticated genetic tools, or you can go the old-fashioned way and go for, artificial selection. You can see it in certain breeds of pigeons and doves and chickens, that they have basically flight feathers on their legs. And they inherit that, at least on a genetic basis, from the dinosaurs that came before them. So that third group that wasn't Dromaeosauridae or Troodontidae. Now the third group is Avialae, and Avialae means bird wings. So at this point, we're really starting to get an animal that is a step closer to what we see in the bodies of modern birds. This is a famous dinosaur, Archaeopteryx lithographica, which was widely heralded as the first bird. We've since found other species like Anchiornis and Jeholornis that either predate or were contemporaneous with Archaeopteryx, although they lived in a different part of the world. Archaeopteryx is kind of an exception to the ones that we've seen so far, in that it comes from the limestone quarries of Germany. This name lithographica actually refers to the fact that the limestone where these fossils are deposited was being quarried in the first place because it was used in lithograph printing. If you've ever seen that process, it involves rolling out ink and the woodcut or whatever you've scratched the stamp that you're printing, rolling it out over this bed of limestone, and that's how you transfer the actual print. So there was a booming industry for collecting this kind of rock in Germany, and lo and behold, they were cracking these rocks open and finding feathers and bones, and eventually quite a few specimens of Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx is the genus, Lithographica is the species of this one, but as we'll see in a couple slides, there were a bunch of other species of Archaeopteryx too. And they might have looked as different to one another as a Steller's jay looks from a blue jay, which you couldn't necessarily tell from just the bones. Although in the case of Archaeopteryx, there are some of those pigments that I mentioned earlier preserved in the feathers. So this kind of black and white patterning is true to what they might have looked like in life. It's impossible to tell exactly where the black and white starts and stops, just because of the fact that the feathers are moved around in the fossilization process. But we did know that that's pretty much the colors that they were working with. And then this bird on the left here shows some similarities to Archaeopteryx. It's Jeholornis, and it's also from northeastern China. So what do we see with the anatomy of these underneath skin? We still have toothed jaws. We've got a flat sternum. So these birds they did not have the anatomical anchoring for the huge flight muscles that modern birds have. So although they have the elongated arms, although they have the flight feathers, they likely were not capable of powered flight to the extent that modern birds are. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't have generated lift by moving their arms in the air. There have been some studies that I think that have put, reconstructions of these animals in wind tunnels and seen how they fare, but I don't have a source for you on that. But by and large, what the bones tell us is that they weren't yet so specialized that they had that carina on the sternum, which is the keel in modern birds that anchors the huge pectoral muscles. And the structure of the shoulder girdle around here and the corresponding musculature of the chest is also going to be an important stage of transition, or an important set of anatomical transitions that lead us up to modern birds as we go forward. Another thing to pay attention to here is that there's a second set of ribs along the bottom of the body cavity. These are called gastralia, and the larger dinosaurs, those theropods from the beginning, they all had this, and it basically provides support to this robust body cavity that's you find in such large animals. But these smaller animals retained, at least in this time in their evolution, they retain those belly ribs, or gastralia as they're called, which modern birds have since lost. And then we've still got this separate fingered hand with claws on each of the 3 fingers, and we still have that elongated claw on the second toe. So along with the bony tail, there are a lot of things that link it to the dinosaurs that we've seen already, and then a lot of things that are already sort of showing the degree of specialization that we get as the development of these specialized feathers on the arms, the surface on the tail that provides lift. All these things are kind of, at this time in the evolution of birds, opening up a new domain of ecological niches that they can start to specialize in. And then once birds kind of crack that part of the ecological conundrum, then you start to see a pretty rapid and pretty diverse radiation of species that comes after that. So there goes Archaeopteryx. So here are those other species of Archaeopteryx that I was talking about. They are both, we're lucky with Archaeopteryx that we have such a volume of specimens that we can see both the growth stages of particular species and then the differences between species within the genus Archaeopteryx. So you can see there's all these different species of Archaeopteryx. We've got multiples of some. We've got Brandis, even though it's got a different genus name. Archaeopteryx siemensii, lithographica, barbarica, and recurva. Well, Jurapteryx is a different one, but we have a bunch of different species of Archaeopteryx and their closest relatives. So they would have been, comparable in size to modern birds. And here's that famous, I think this is the, I forget the name of this particular specimen, but it's the one that is most closely associated with Archaeopteryx remains when I think the public thinks about them. Okay, so a close relative of Archaeopteryx is this dinosaur here called Anchiornis huxleyi. Now, it was a little bit smaller than Archaeopteryx, and again, this one is from northeastern China, where Archaeopteryx is from Germany, and this animal lived about 160 million years ago. So it predates, again, a lot of the other birds that are closer to the modern ones in the phylogeny, but it shows a lot of the same anatomical characteristics. And I wanted to highlight this species because it's probably the best example that we have of the preservation of pigments in fossil feathers. So on the top right here, you can see that the the fossil not only shows the feathers themselves, but also here you see what's called the propatagium. So a patagium is just a membrane of skin that goes between a pair of bones. And the propatagium specifically is the one in birds that goes from the shoulder to the wrist. So birds, even when they spread their wings as far out as they can go, they're never extending their arm out like this. The arm is always bent at an angle like that, and it's skin that connects this wrist to the shoulder. So in Anchiornis, we have that membrane of skin preserved, but then we also have the feathers that go along with it. And the color that comes along with those is preserved in high resolution. Pigmentation in modern bird feathers is mediated by at least with melanin, it's mediated by these cells called melanosomes, and they are, their chemical composition is resilient and stable, and they don't break down over time. And so by comparing how certain patterns of melanosome deposition in modern birds correspond to the colors that we see with our eyes, we can basically use that as a Rosetta Stone to go and translate what the patterns of these microscopic cells that are preserved in the fossil feathers tell us about the colors that they would have corresponded to in life. So for Anchiornis, the revolutionary thing with this dinosaur was that it preserved these pigmentation cells all throughout the body. So we do know that this animal had a red crest on the back of its head. It had this black and white checkering on the wings, and for the most part, it was sort of blackish gray throughout the body. And already, right off the bat, I mean, you start to see things that you might have already inferred just from the fact that they're living in the same way to modern birds. They're kind of an animal in an ecosystem that has to attract mates and fend off rivals and, perhaps guard a territory. But the fact that there is that bright color on the back of the head that corresponds with the crest just is another piece of evidence towards the fact that they were using these colors and these structures for display in much the same way that modern birds were. And there are I didn't include it in this presentation, though I might have benefited from doing so, but there's another bird called Confucius ornis that, again, is from China, which you might have told from the name. But that bird, we have so many specimens of that bird that you can see the molt stages from juveniles to adult. You can see the sexual dimorphism in those birds. And so the fossil record is pretty comprehensive when it comes to certain members of the family tree that led to molt. So within this group, remember, we're still in Aviale here. I have a phylogeny that will show it in a second, but here we can go now. The next group now, we're looking, if you were to go back here, we're expanding this part of the tree right here. So Aviale, within it it comprises these lineages here. So one of those lineages is ornithothoraces, and that's the one that leads to modern birds, or that contains the ancestors of modern birds and their descendants. So we've got the first branch out here is enantiornids, which means opposite birds. And then we've got euornids and ornithurae. So we'll talk about each one of those categories in detail. But to start with an overview of this whole set of lineages called ornithothoraces, we'll take a look at their anatomy here. So ornithothorax just means, bird abdomen. So at this point, you're starting to get some more specialized anatomical features. One of the things you might notice right away is that in these groups of birds, you start to see the loss of teeth and the development of the keratinous beak. And you start to see the weak, faint definition of a keel on the sternum, as well as the loss of that specialized toe claw, and actually the inversion of this hallux here, which is the first toe claw, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I know that the hallux is the reverse claw here. Whether it's the first or not is out of my wheelhouse here. But you also, for the first time, see fused tail vertebrae. Now, that is a huge evolutionary innovation on the line that leads to modern birds. If you think about it from an energy conservation standpoint, Um, a long tail with sturdy feathers, a long and sturdy tail is beneficial for a whole number of reasons. First and foremost, it helps with generating lift. It helps with steering and directing the movement in the air. And also it provides a surface for patterns, plumage patterns that are used for display, and a whole host of other beneficial uh, adaptations that come along with it that if you if you didn't have that, you might be losing out on. The only caveat that comes with it, though, is that taking to the air with a whole conga line of vertebrae going out, past your hip bones, is a whole lot of extra weight that if you can bear to get rid of it and still retain the aerodynamic function of the tail, then you're going to be better off, evolutionarily speaking, than if you weren't able to do that. So this fusion of the tail vertebrae here into a structure called the pygostyle basically anchors these elongated flight feathers that in many cases are still able to provide the aerodynamic benefits of the bony tail without being nearly as costly in terms of weight or energy production for making all those bones. So this is an evolutionary innovation that you see within this group of birds and no others. So these are the ornithothoraces. Now, it is worth mentioning here that the fingers are kind of following the same evolutionary trajectory of the tail. The bones are fusing together. It allows for a more stable support of the feathers of the wing, and where in previous groups that we've looked at so far, the fingers probably played a role in the ecology of the animals. They were climbing and grasping things with the fingers. This reversal of the toe allows them to be perching in trees and not have to rely so heavily on the hands. And so if you can get away with not having those individually mobile fingers, then and it does confer a benefit to fuse them, then that's what you see happen in the fossil record. But I bring up the Hoatzin here because it shows that the evolutionary affinities of the Hoatzin have been debated for a long time because of just how strange the chicks are. They actually show the same pattern of individually separate fingers that are each tipped with a little claw here. And it has confused evolutionary biologists for a long time because it seemed that this is a basal trait that was just never lost. And so it was thought that maybe these were a representative of a really ancient lineage, that they were sister to all the other birds. But I actually don't know where in the phylogeny the most recent studies have placed them, but it's certainly well within the radiation of more derived, more recently evolved land birds. So they're not necessarily, evolutionary holdovers, but it goes to show that there's still within their genetic makeup lies the mechanism to create these individually mobile fingers. In the ancient ornithothoraces, you have two. In this little Hoatzin chick, you've got pretty much the same arrangement. You have one mobile here, and then these two are kind of fused together back here. They, interestingly enough, are lost as the chick becomes an adult. And you might have heard the phrase, development follows phylogeny, or development mirrors phylogeny. So that's kind of the idea that animals, in the course of developing from embryo to adult, kind of mirror the anatomical changes that their ancestors went through, over evolutionary time. So the physiological process of turning these individually mobile fingers into a fused hand probably shares a lot in common with the genetic mechanisms that were working in the ancestors of modern birds that turn those separately mobile fingers into a fused hand. Okay, so This bird, Concornis lacustris, is from Spain. Yeah. So this one is from the same time period as the other birds, 125 million years ago. But this one is from Spain. So at this point, birds are radiating throughout the continents that are closest to where they originated, or where, we see that we're first finding them. And that probably had a lot to do with the increased ability for dispersal that comes with flight. And then on the bottom here, we have a bird called Cynornis centensis. And Cynornis is a representative of a really interesting group of birds called enantiornids. And the name itself means opposite birds. The reason for that being that their shoulder girdles are oriented in such a way that the muscles, the muscles that control powered flight in modern birds, the muscles that are responsible for the upstroke of the wing and the downstroke of the wing are both situated on the front of the bird's chest. So they're both attached to that keel on the sternum. And it's basically, some of you might have a better idea in terms of the physics of how this works, but aerodynamically, it confers a benefit for them. But the enantiornids, they had a completely different flight configuration, and it's not to say that it was less efficient. The key takeaway point here is that the difference in anatomy between the enantiornids and the euornids, which C is the sister group on this side, enantiornids had that musculature distributed from both on the front and on the back of the spine, so above the shoulders, which is a completely different way than modern birds have it. But the takeaway point here is that both of these groups independently came to powered flight. They didn't necessarily inherit that same anatomical character from a common ancestor. They came to the powered flight on their own evolutionary trajectories that were parallel to one another. So they are convergent on modern birds in the ability to have powered flight, to fly. And that goes to show that this is sort of the origin point for what we would consider to be anatomically modern birds, the euornids here. So before we go on to the euornids, I wanted to include this profile of Rapaxavis panni here, because it was the one that I illustrated from the beginning. This is found, surprise, in northeastern China, but from actually a different formation than the rest of them. So many of the others came from the Yixian formation. This one's from the Jiufutan formation. And it was basically, the thought goes that it might have been a little bit like a kingfisher. These birds still had teeth, but only at the front of the jaw. And what we'll see going forward is that the position of teeth in the jaw and where they're situated in the bones of the jaw has a lot to do with where the beak itself is too. The beak of a modern bird is composed of a whole bunch of keratinous plates that are each over one set of bones in the skull. We'll talk about this as we get further in the presentation, but in modern birds, they're all fused together to form a continuous surface. That's called the rhamphotheca. There's your Scrabble word. The rhamphotheca is that continuous surface of keratin that goes from the culmen, the base of the beak, to the tip of the beak. But in these stem birds, the beak hadn't yet fused into a continuous surface like that. You had what's called a compound rhamphotheca. And the bones of the jaw that support teeth would not have been supporting keratin to form a beak too. So in this one, it's kind of it's sort of bucking the trend in that as some of the ones that we go on and see, you'll see that they have teeth at the back of their mouth, but not at the front. And the front is where you start to see that keratin developing to form what eventually becomes the beak in modern birds. But that evolution of the beak happened in a stepwise fashion. It didn't just, it wasn't one evolutionary innovation, it was a whole series of them that then compounded later. But while we're here, Rapaxavis had a toothy front of its mouth, and the fact that there wasn't a beak there maybe meant that it was uh, fleshy and sensitive towards potential prey items. Um, and it also had these grasping feet here. Rapax avis means grasping bird. So you can infer a lot about the ecology of extinct species just from, excuse me, looking at their anatomy too. Okay, so now finally we're arriving at the euorniths, or in other words, the true birds. Um, this is one step more reductive, one step less inclusive than the ornithothoraces, and its sister overall to the enantiorniths. So the opposite birds, the enantiorniths, that had that mirrored configuration of the shoulder girdle, they didn't leave any modern descendants. They were around at the same time as anatomically modern birds at the end of the Cretaceous. No one knows why they didn't make it past the extinction event. It would seem that they were living in by and large the same way as modern birds. They were the same size. You know, the end of the Mesozoic period, it said, put a filter on anything larger than a crocodile. If you were an animal that, you know, needed a certain threshold of food to sustain yourself that just was not available in an environment choked out by soot that a comet in the Yucatan kicked up into the atmosphere for hundreds of years, then you just weren't going to cut it. But you know, the enantiorniths, they were so similar to modern birds that it's difficult to understand why they died out and modern birds didn't. But there are some theories as to why that is the case. But at this point, the euorniths are showing, there they go. The euorniths are showing the same, basically, anatomy that we see in modern birds today. So this bird, Hongshanornis longicresta, again, Chinese name, Chinese bird. It was named longicresta because when the fossils were first found, it looked like it had this projection of a crest coming out from the top of its head. There's a little bit of question as to whether that's what's called a taphonomic artifact. So sometimes it looks like an animal will have a structure, a weird quirk in its anatomy, but really, it's just an artifact of the fossilization process. So a piece of bone gets bent out of the way, or you know, a flap of skin or feather gets distorted. But you know, that's kind of up for speculation still. But if you look at the skeleton of this bird, unfortunately, there weren't any clean-cut diagrams like we had for the other skeletal slides. But if you were to look at the skeleton of this bird, you'd see that it doesn't show those. It doesn't show that it's got that fused tail. It doesn't show that elongated claw on the foot, and it's got a beak already, so no teeth in the mouth. It looks like it might still actually don't. This picture is a little bit inconclusive as to whether or not it's got teeth, but at this point in the evolutionary process, there are still some species that had teeth. But if you look at the reconstruction on the fossil on the right here, you can see that the beak is a lot more extensive than in previous groups that we've looked at so far. So now within that group of euorniths, now we are in ornithurae, or bird tails. And this is the last stop before you get to modern birds. So again, we still have some birds that have teeth here. And these birds are around at the very latest Cretaceous. They're still sharing their environment with the non-avian dinosaurs, and they comprise the ancestors of modern birds, although they themselves, you know, the species that we see here, do not have direct descendants. Ichthyornis dispar is a pretty commonly fossilized bird, which meant it was probably very numerous at the time when it lived, and it's found in lakeside or coastline depositional environments. So in this reconstruction here, it's sort of imagined as looking a bit like a gull, and the skeleton sort of bears that out. And that was a species that did have teeth as well. So on the right here, we've got another sort of crazy group of birds. The species here is Hesperornis regalis, but overall the group of birds that this belongs to are the Hesperorniths. And they are convergent on basically loons and penguins. They were enormously large birds, about as long as an average person, up to 6 feet from, the tip of their beak to the back of their tail, more or less. There are some that are smaller. There are a few different genera and a few different species within each of the genera of this group. But this is another group of birds that, although it's similar anatomically to modern birds, it doesn't have any living descendants. Ichthyornis, back from the previous slide, here is a representation of two individuals that we have, two specimens differentiated by their little label here. Ichthyornis was sort of the last step outside what we would just call modern birds. It still had teeth. It, like I said, it lived in coast and shoreline environments, and it was among the birds that were around at the end of the Cretaceous. So finally, we arrive at neorniths. And before we get to the condor here, we have this little guy, Asteriornis maastrichtensis. Whenever you see ensis at the end of a Latin name, that means it comes from a place. But in this instance, it's both the place and the time named after the place. So Maastrichtian is the age of the Cretaceous, the latest age of the Cretaceous period. And Asteriornis is, for all intents and purposes, it is a modern bird. The phylogenetic position of this one, I think it's placed close to the radiation that led to Gallo and Ceres, so both waterfowl and landfowl. So this is a stem bird that is on that lineage. And at this point, you've just got a modern bird skeleton. The beak is totally fused. There's no teeth. You have the hand completely fused into the configuration of fingers that we see today. And you have the tail fused into a pygostyle. The feet are anatomically modern. So this is just an extinct bird. I am not going to cover the Cenozoic radiation of extinct birds and fossil birds, just because there is so much diversity after the extinction of the rest of the dinosaurs. But what I will touch on is that extinction event itself. Now, I asked earlier the question of why it was that certain lineages of birds left no descendants in the modern time. Why did they go extinct and others didn't? Well, as it turns out, some research indicates that it might have had to do with their diet. And their diet can be inferred from the extent of the beak and the position of teeth in their jaw. So the birds that did survive are those that might have looked a little bit like this reconstruction here on the bottom right. This bird looks a lot like a tinamou, but it's not meant to be, a modern tinamou. But the ratites, the tinamous, the emus, the ostriches, the cassowaries, they are the basalmost, the earliest branching lineage of modern birds, which means they were the closest in terms of evolutionary radiation to the birds that were alive at the end of the Mesozoic. And birds that were eating seeds and small fruits, plant matter like that, typically had this fused beak configuration. Whereas birds that were probably preying on, insects and small reptiles and, nestlings of other dinosaurs, other birds, it's pretty safe to say that those are the ones with teeth. So in the collapse of a food chain, when you have a huge ecological disturbance like, the Chicxulub asteroid, which ended the Cretaceous period, you see a sort of filter where the latest thinking on this goes that um, what caused the filtering of the bird lineages that didn't make it today was the fact that terrestrial ecosystems, especially mediated by plants, were collapsing as a result of the deposition of all this debris and soot into the air following the impact that blocked out the sun. And so plants were not producing the amount of plant matter that, you know, large herbivores could sustain, or even, you know, small herbivorous animals could have fed on. But what they did leave in the ground um, was a large number of seeds. Plants today, you see it in the in the deserts of California. They will deposit huge numbers of seeds into the ground to form seed banks, so that in years when there are favorable conditions, those seeds can then all germinate out. And take advantage of those conditions. Now, those are plants that are specialized to arid environments, and that wasn't the case for everything that was around at the end of the Cretaceous. But the sheer biomass of plants that was around at that time, the thinking goes, produced enough seeds that seed-eating birds were able to subsist on what was already just deposited on the ground. They weren't eating new growth. They weren't eating, basically anything higher up on the food chain than something that a plant had already produced. And so that's why they were kind of able to make it through. Now, again, this is like looking through the foggiest of glasses at something hundreds of miles away, chronologically speaking. It's so hard to get a clear view of what was happening at this time. So this is just, pretty fast and loose speculation of what we have to work with. But there is some data that shows that following the end of the Cretaceous period, there was a concurrent diversification of flowering plants, angiosperms, and modern birds. So as ecosystems started to pick back up, there was sort of this gradual increase in diversity in both plants and modern birds. And so following the age of dinosaurs, I would like to think that we're still in the age of dinosaurs since we still have birds, but, sure, we've got to lend it to the mammals. They credit where credit is due. But following the age of dinosaurs, birds were really closely tied with the diversification of land plants, flowering plants to be specific. During the Mesozoic, when all these other, birds that we've looked at so far, when they were doing their thing and diversifying, the majority of the land flora was made up of coniferous plants, so gymnosperms, things like pines and ferns and strange things that don't even have descendants in this modern day. But when the end Cretaceous extinction happened, the fossil record shows that there was this shift in communities of terrestrial plants towards flowering plants, angiosperms, and they were able to they have faster metabolisms. They were able to colonize this disturbed environment quicker than the gargantuan conifers that had lived in 250 million years of hothouse world with stable conditions, and basically reshape the makeup of terrestrial ecosystems. And so for further inquiry, if you ever are interested in finding out what happened after all this, this is the context that you'll find it. That brings me to the end of the talk, and I want to close it out with this recommended reading. I got the vast majority of these images and this information from these two books. The one on the left is called A Field Guide to Mesozoic Birds and Other Winged Dinosaurs. And the one on the right is a really recent one by Lynx Editions called Birds of the Mesozoic. And what I love about both of these books is that they present reconstructions of these animals like in the field guide format. It's like picking up a Sibley or a Kaufman and looking at birds that have been extinct for hundreds of millions of years. Um, there's information on every stage of anatomical transition that I talked about today, and a whole lot more that I couldn't fit into the talk. But hopefully you have at least a better idea of how this transition happened over time, and basically what goes into making modern birds. Um, I'll leave you with my references and open it to questions. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. We that was absolutely wonderful. Speaking of questions, if you have any questions, please put them in our Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. That'll help keep us in line so we can make sure we don't miss anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diego.
What was
that was just awesome.
Of course. What was the title of the documentary from which one of the illustrations was derived? Prehistoric Planet on Apple TV. So,
Prehistoric Planet.
yeah. It's
Apple
basically, yeah, they hired the best of the best when it comes to consultants for, those reconstructions. So if you want the most up-to-date look on, what dinosaurs looked like and how they behaved, Prehistoric Planet, that's your best bet.
It's like a documentary.
It is a documentary, yes.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Very cool.
Yeah, some spectacular artwork. I tried to credit the artists where I could. A lot of these images I just had saved on my computer. So please, if you know or ever encounter anyone who is responsible for one of these artworks who I couldn't find the name of, please. I only had two artworks of mine in there. It was the Daspletosaurus at the beginning and Rapaxavis. So everybody else from some fantastic artists.
Fantastic. You're getting lots of thank yous
Oh yeah,
chat.
when did any evidence of a syrinx appear? Okay, so as far as I know, the evolution of the syrinx is first documented in this bird called Vegab, or actually syrinx and larynx, sometimes I mix up a little bit, but I do know that there are vocal anatomies preserved in this bird called Vegavis, which is like on the lineage that leads to ducks and geese. And Vegavis was actually around at the end of the Cretaceous period. So I don't know. I think the syrinx is what allows birds to make like complex song, and that evolved way later, like well into the Cenozoic period in Australia. That was a wholly post-Cretaceous, post-Mesozoic thing. Okay, the next question is, what were the largest birds that made it through the KT boundary? You mentioned that emus, ostriches, etc. are ancient, but they're large. So emus, ostriches, etc., they are not, they are secondarily large. So they are derived from small birds. It's funny. For a long time, people thought that that emus, cassowaries, ostriches, that they are all descended from one large ancestor. But no, what's actually the case is that way back when the southern continents were all sort of closer together than they are now, the ancestors of all the flightless birds that you see on different continents. So in South America, it's the rheas. In Australia, it's the emus and cassowaries. And in Africa, it's the ostriches. The ancestors of those were birds that looked a lot like tinamous. And so they independently flew across the ocean to each of those separate continents. And then, for whatever reason, because there were similar niches available to them, they all independently of one another attained that huge size. So they regained that gigantism after being descended from birds that were smaller to begin with. So I hope that answers the question. Well, actually, the largest birds that made it through the KT boundary, or KPG boundary as it's called now, Cretaceous Tertiary, Cretaceous Paleogene, splitting hairs. But the biggest one, I think the biggest one that I know of is called Patagopteryx, and it wasn't any bigger than like the guinea fowl. Would you consider many of the steppe species, i.e. Utahraptor, T-Rex, bird-like reptiles, or mostly birds? It's like it's like a rectangle and a square. All squares are rectangles, but not every rectangle is a square. So if you are looking at reptile versus bird, like every bird is a reptile, but not every reptile is a bird. Um, it's kind of arbitrary to say, is this more like a reptile than a bird, or more like a bird than a reptile? Because those categories, like one includes the other. It's like saying there's uh, I mean, I guess there is like a practical use in, everybody kind of knows that, okay, when you say a reptile, you mean something with scales and crawls around on four legs. But it's sort of hard to draw the line at any certain point. So I I would say that just because I think there is value in saying that, like, okay, T-Rex is not a bird, but it is a reptile. So I would call T-Rex a bird-like reptile, but I would call Utah Raptor I don't know. I don't know. I plead the fifth on that one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lily. And are anything else that any other questions that pop up? Please throw. Oh, here we go.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, what do we got? Based on what we know of the environment, why were adaptations being selected that led to dinosaurs that would later adapt to modern birds? Why these intermediate animals? Because you've got a great big temperate rainforest. Like at this time in the areas where these fossils are coming from, it's like how we have birds now. I mean, there are insects in the trees, there are fruit hanging from branches. Somebody's going to eat those things. And the fact that there are food items that are only accessible by being arboreal, and the fact that you can escape predators by getting into the air, the fact that you can display with your feathers, all these things are providing an incentive to adapt in the way that these animals have adapted. So no one, like if you had asked Hongshanornis longicresta, like, are you a missing link? You would have been like, no, I'm the end here. This is the point. This is the destination. They, each and every one of those individually were, the most specialized lineage that their line had yet produced. And it's all just, the process of natural selection.
Yeah.
Perhaps you discussed this, but did any early birds with teeth make it into the Cenozoic? No. As far as I know, no. I've always been suspicious about. How could it be that? I think that, like, if I had to, like, place bets, like, I don't know if you ever listen to Art Bell, he used to do those predictions for the new year. Like, if I had to place a bet on what we'd find in the next 10 years, it's like a Paleogene bird with teeth. Like, I'm sure that at least a couple of them squeaked through. But as far as I know, there aren't any that have yet been found. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. What were teeth made up of what we call teeth today? Yes, that's a good point, because you look at a merganser, or you look at a bird that's got serrations on the beak. Those are not teeth. What I've been calling teeth in this are true teeth. It's enamel, and it's coming out of the dentary bone itself, and not a projection of the keratin that's covering the bone. So yes, teeth are made up of what we call teeth today.
Thanks, Ivan. Anything else?
Can you say something about the pigmentation
Yes.
in birds? You said there's melanin. Are there other pigments, like that show up, like carotenoids or other
carotenoids? Yeah, carotenoids are like the one in that Anchiornis, the red on the back of its head, and the Sinosauropteryx. Those are carotenoids too. I didn't mention the specific name of the cell that's responsible for showing that. I think the cell might also just be called a melanosome, even if the pigment that it's holding or storing is a carotenoid. I don't know. I have to double check on that. But I do know that carotenoids are visible still, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see those oranges and reds you see in the fossil record.
Later on. Excellent. And I think we're
Yep.
Keep them going. Yes, the carotenoids would be from their diet. So just like you get, like, the printer runs out of ink and you get a yellow house finch, you might have gotten like a yellow Sinosauropteryx instead of an orange. They're eating funky stuff.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I think now we're pretty much slowed down. Diego, thank you very much for a wonderful webinar. I think we all had a
Yeah.
wonderful time.
Thank
Yeah,
you guys.
fantastic.
I'm glad that I was able to just sit here and talk about this all.
Oh yeah.
Reading,
fanta-
listening to a most remarkable creature, Hudson Darwin refs on intelligence and biological inheritance across the world of eons, starring the Karakara, FYI, Hunt for Intelligence, the Karakara. All right, I'll make note of that. Reading.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you, Yvonne. This was a truly brilliant presentation. A most remarkable creature. I'm going to copy his, or do I get like a transcript of this at the end?
I think
We could
we can
probably get
you.
them, but copy it now just in case.
Forget it. I've copied it. It's all good.
Okay, good.
Okay, excellent.
Karakara
I
are
want to.
cool.
I want to get in my time machine and go birding back in.
I know, right?
I,
People always say like, "Hey, if you could go back in time to any period in history, like who would you talk to?" So I was like, "Oh, Abraham Lincoln. Oh, I want to talk to
right.
see George Washington." No, man, I want to go sit
No,
with
I
my
would bring my
Lycos
binoculars.
in the
Yeah.
early
No,
Cretaceous
no,
period
no,
of
no, no,
China.
no. You have to use the optics of the day. Sorry, Mark.
Oh boy, yeah, I'm gonna be no glasses. She's sitting there in a loincloth, squinting.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you again.
Thank you,
We
Diego.
Yeah,
really
thank you, Diego.
Yes.
Of
Thank
course,
you.
thank
Very
you
well
guys.
And please join us next week. We'll have Doug Robinson here talk about brown ducks. So we're looking forward to that also.
Everything you
And
want to know about eclipse plumage.
Awesome.
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you all very much. And again, thank you, Diego. And
Thank you guys.
we will see everyone next week. Take care, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Bye,
Thanks
everyone.
Good night
again.
now.
Good
Thank
night,
you,
Diego.
Diego.
Bye bye.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Talk to you later.
Bye.